3,000 kilometers. That's how much of the desert China has already buried under trees. 3,000 kilometers, and they're not done. They're not even close. Right now, in the driest, most punishing stretch of land on Earth, China is pulling off the largest act of ecological engineering in human history. An artificial forest so enormous it makes every other conservation project on the planet look like a weekend hobby. And the West? The West is watching, taking notes, and quietly realizing it has no equivalent answer. Here's what makes this insane. This isn't a plan. It's not a proposal on some government minister's desk. It's happening. It has been happening since 1978. For over 4 decades, China has been waging a war against its own geography, and it is winning. So stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why scientists from 87 countries have flown to China just to study what's being built here. You're going to understand why Africa looked at this project and said, we need to copy that. And you're going to understand why what China is doing in its northern deserts might be the single most important environmental undertaking on Earth right now. If you're new here, subscribe, because this channel covers the stories that don't get told loudly enough. Let's set the scene. Northern China, 1970s. The Gobi Desert, one of the largest deserts on the planet, is moving. Not slowly, not gradually. It is swallowing land at a rate of 3,600 square kilometers every single year. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of Luxembourg, vanishing every year, under sand. Cities that had existed for centuries were being buried. Farmers would wake up and find their fields gone, not flooded, not frozen, but consumed. Beijing, one of the most populated cities on Earth, was being hit by more than 50 dust storms annually. These weren't light haze events. We're talking walls of sand hundreds of feet high, shutting down airports, forcing millions of people indoors, coating everything in a toxic orange powder. Respiratory disease spiked 300%. Crop yields dropped 40%. The economic bleeding was $54 billion a year, every year. Sit with that number, $54 billion a year, just from dust. And this was a crisis of China's own making. In the 1950s, rapid industrialization had driven massive deforestation. Trees that had anchored the soil for centuries were cut down in years. Without root systems holding the ground, the desert didn't just approach, it accelerated. The land that had once been a buffer became a launch pad. By the late 1970s, 1/3 of China's farmland was at risk. Not theoretically at risk, actually at risk. The desert was on course to reach major population centers within decades. So in 1978, the Chinese government made a decision that was either visionary or delusional, depending on who you asked at the time. They decided to build a wall, not stone, not concrete, trees, the 3 North Shelter Forest Program. That's the official name. You've probably never heard it. The world calls it the Great Green Wall. And once you understand the scale, you'll know why. Here's the what. A continuous forest barrier stretching 4,500 kilometers across northern China. Not a line of trees, a system, in some places stretching 100 kilometers wide. The total planned forest area is 4.69 million square kilometers. Say that again, 4.69 million square kilometers. That is larger than the entire landmass of Western Europe, combined. The timeline, 72 years. 1978 to 2050. The budget, $56.2 billion. And as of right now, they have already completed 3,000 kilometers of that barrier, planted over 100 billion trees, and the project is running ahead of schedule. 100 billion trees. If you place them side by side, they would circle the Earth 60 times. That's not a metaphor, that's the arithmetic. Now here's where it gets insane. Most people hear planting trees in a desert and picture someone digging a hole, dropping a seedling, and watching it die in a week. And they're right. That's exactly what would happen. Which is why China didn't do that. What they actually did is where this story gets genuinely strange. The Great Green Wall isn't one project, it's 3, running simultaneously across 3 climate zones, each one facing a different version of the same impossible problem. In the northwest, at the driest section where annual rainfall can drop below 200 millimeters, that's Sahara-level dry. Chinese scientists invented something called the fish scale pit. Picture this. Instead of planting trees in flat ground, they sculpted the earth into a series of crescent-shaped depressions, each one angled and curved to catch and hold every single drop of rainfall before it can evaporate or run off. It sounds simple. It's not. It requires precise topographical engineering at massive scale. And the result? Tree survival rates went from 20% to 80%. They quadrupled their survival rate with a hole in the ground. But the real work is happening in laboratories. Since the program began, Chinese scientists have developed 85 entirely new tree varieties, engineered specifically for this environment. The standout is a modified Siberian elm whose root system can penetrate 80 meters into the earth. 80 meters. That's the depth of a 26-story building, straight down, and it can survive on just 100 millimeters of annual rainfall. That's less water than many cacti require. This is not gardening. This is genetic and geophysical engineering applied to one of the harshest biomes on the planet. And the logistics alone should break your brain. Coordinating tree planting across a region that spans 5 Chinese provinces involves hundreds of millions of individual planting sites and requires continuous maintenance across decades. And that's not a forestry project. That's a military operation. China treated it like one. Local governments were assigned mandatory planting quotas. Communities were mobilized. School children participated in tree planting days that weren't optional. At its peak, the program employed more workers than the entire population of several European countries. There is no equivalent mobilization of human labor for an ecological objective anywhere else in recorded history. And here's something that doesn't get said enough. Most of these workers weren't scientists. They were farmers. Former farmers in many cases, people whose land had already been taken by the desert, now recruited to fight it back. They learned the fish scale technique by hand, in the field, in conditions that were genuinely brutal. Temperatures swinging from -30 in winter to +40 in summer. Wind that stripped skin, sand in everything, and they kept planting. That human dimension matters, because when people in the West debate environmental policy, it's usually framed as a question of technology, or money, or political will. China's Great Green Wall is a reminder that sometimes the answer is also just people, enough people, organized well enough, working long enough, low tech and high endurance. So does it work? Here's the proof. Forest cover in northern China has risen from 5% to 13.5% since the program began. That's nearly tripling green coverage across a region the size of a continent in 4 decades. Between 2000 and 2017, China alone accounted for 25% of all new green space created on the entire surface of the Earth. One country, a quarter of the planet's new vegetation. Full stop. Those dust storms that once choked Beijing, down 81%. The city that once had more than 50 sand events per year now regularly sees blue skies where there was once orange haze. Farmers who watched their fields advance toward desert are now harvesting fruit, nuts, and timber in regions that were classified as wasteland a generation ago. New forest-based industries have created millions of jobs. Former desert towns are becoming tourist destinations. And that's the part nobody's talking about, the economic transformation. This isn't just an environmental project. It's a development project. It's a jobs program. It's a food security program. It is simultaneously the largest carbon sink construction project in human history, capturing millions of tons of CO2 annually, and a rural poverty reduction initiative. All the same trees, all the same wall. Now here's the kicker. Other countries noticed. Nearly 1,000 specialists from 87 different nations have traveled to China specifically to study the Great Green Wall's methods. Let that land. 87 countries sending their best environmental scientists to learn from what China is doing in the Gobi. When's the last time the United States, Germany, or Japan hosted a knowledge transfer program for desert reversal that attracted that kind of global interest? Africa looked at China's model and launched its own. The African Great Green Wall Initiative involves 11 countries cooperating to build a green barrier stretching the entire width of the continent, from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to Djibouti on the Red Sea, to hold back the Saharan advance. The blueprint? China's. The technical advisors? In many cases, Chinese. The fact that a program launched by a developing nation in 1978 under enormous domestic pressure with technology that didn't yet fully exist has become the global standard for fighting desertification. That is a geopolitical statement as loud as any aircraft carrier. And in Central Asia, where desertification is erasing Soviet-era farmland at alarming rates, governments are running the same calculation China ran in 1978. Can we afford to do this? And increasingly, the answer being reached is, can we afford not to? Here's what that means in plain terms. China didn't just solve a domestic problem, it exported a methodology. It became the world's leading authority on reversing land degradation at scale. In a world where an estimated 40% of the Earth's land surface is already degraded, where the UN estimates desertification threatens the livelihoods of over 1 billion people, that expertise is geopolitical currency, soft power with deep roots. Literally, now. I want to be fair with you, because this is where a lesser channel would just keep playing the hype reel. The Great Green Wall has real problems, significant ones. The biggest vulnerability isn't sand, it's water. When you plant forests in a region receiving Sahara-level rainfall, those trees don't just consume surface water. They draw from groundwater reserves. And in some sections of the Great Green Wall, groundwater tables are dropping. The trees are drinking the aquifer. The very resource the forests need to survive long-term may be being depleted by the act of planting them. This is not a minor technical footnote. It's an existential risk for sections of the project. Then there's the monoculture problem. Large portions of the forest wall were planted with a single species, efficient for scale, catastrophic for resilience. A monoculture forest is ecologically brittle in the same way an immune-compromised population is medically brittle. One pathogen, one beetle, one fungus with a taste for that specific species, and entire sections can collapse. Some areas have already experienced this. There are places where officials are replanting the same sections for the second or third time because earlier monoculture stands failed. And in certain regions, the desert is still advancing faster than the trees can be planted, the hole in the bucket. Despite 100 billion trees, some frontline communities are still losing ground. China knows this. They are not pretending otherwise. The strategy has already evolved. New drought-resistant varietals, advanced irrigation systems using 70% less water. Deliberate diversification away from single species stands toward multi-layer ecosystems of shrubs, grasses, and mixed tree species. The program is not static. It is being rewritten in real time based on what the data shows. That intellectual honesty, the willingness to acknowledge failure and adapt, is arguably more impressive than the original ambition. But there's a deeper lesson here that the critics miss. Every major engineering project in history, the Hoover Dam, the Channel Tunnel, the Apollo program, has had sections that failed, had to be redesigned, had to be rebuilt. Nobody uses those failures to argue that the projects weren't worth attempting. The Great Green Wall should be held to the same standard. The question is not whether it's perfect. The question is whether the trajectory is right. And the trajectory, forest coverage tripling, dust storms down 81%, 25% of Earth's new vegetation, says yes. Unambiguously, yes. There's also something that rarely gets acknowledged. The communities living inside the Green Wall are not passive recipients. They are active participants. Local farmers have developed their own micro-techniques, their own species preferences, their own planting calendars tailored to their specific valleys and slopes. The program's genius, in its second generation, is that it stopped trying to run everything from Beijing and started listening to the people standing in the sand. The result is a project that is simultaneously one of the most centralized ecological programs ever designed, and one of the most localized in its execution. That combination, top-down ambition, bottom-up knowledge, is not something most Western bureaucracies have been able to replicate. Here's the second act. While most people focus on the forest wall itself, there's a parallel story almost nobody covers. In the same period China was planting its 100 billion trees, it was also developing an entirely new field of science, desert solar. Because here's the irony. The same brutal conditions that make the Gobi a desertification catastrophe, the relentless sun, the vast flat terrain, the absence of cloud cover, make it one of the most valuable solar energy sites on Earth. China hasn't just been fighting the desert, it has been monetizing it. The Gobi and surrounding regions now host some of the largest solar farms in the world. And something unexpected started happening. The panels provided shade. Shade reduced soil evaporation. Reduced evaporation allowed vegetation to take hold around the panel bases, and vegetation reduced wind erosion. The solar farms were accidentally helping the reforestation. Now that's deliberate. China is designing photovoltaic plus agriculture zones specifically to use solar infrastructure as a desert stabilization tool. The energy project and the ecological project are converging, and nobody in the Western energy policy establishment is talking about this combination at comparable scale. So zoom all the way out. What does this actually mean? China started this project when Deng Xiaoping was still consolidating power. The Berlin Wall hadn't fallen. The internet didn't exist, and they committed, in writing, backed by money and policy, to a 72-year engineering program to reverse the trajectory of one of Earth's largest desert systems. 72 years. The United States struggles to maintain infrastructure funding across 4-year election cycles. Germany's energy transition has been paralyzed by coalition politics for a decade. Japan's reforestation efforts, while genuine, cover a fraction of the scale, and China quietly planted 100 billion trees. Think about what a 72-year commitment actually means in political terms. It means the government that signed the original decree in 1978 knew that it would never see the project finished. The officials who drew up the plans, who negotiated the budgets, who sent the first workers into the field, they are dead. Their children are middle-aged, and the program is still running, on schedule. Because the institutional structure was built to outlast the individuals inside it. That's not just ambition. That's a different theory of governance entirely. Compare that to the West's track record on long-range ecological commitments. The United States launched its own shelter belts program during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Same basic concept. Tree barriers to hold back desertification in the Great Plains. It worked, modestly, for a few decades. Then it was defunded. The trees were cleared for agriculture. The program disbanded. Today, large sections of those original shelter belts are gone, and parts of the American Great Plains are experiencing desertification pressures that scientists are watching with increasing unease. The infrastructure that once held the soil was dismantled because it wasn't profitable quarter to quarter. Nobody made a 72-year commitment. Nobody made a 30-year commitment. And here we are. This is the real competition. Not just chips, not just rockets, not just naval tonnage. The competition is also who is making 72-year decisions. Who is building things that won't pay off until their grandchildren are in power? Because that kind of institutional patience, that ability to hold a strategic commitment across generations, is itself a form of power. And right now, on that specific dimension, the scorecard is not flattering for the West. The Gobi is not just a desert, it is a test of whether human civilization can make decisions on the timescale that ecological problems actually require. China passed the first half of that test. The second half, water management, biodiversity, long-term resilience, is still being graded. There's a quote I keep coming back to. It comes from one of the Chinese engineers who worked on the early fish-scale pit trials in the 1980s, in a region where tree survival was under 20%, and the project was being called a failure by outside observers. He said, "We are not planting trees, we are planting time." Planting time. That's what this project is. Every one of those 100 billion trees is a decision made before its benefit arrives. A bet placed by one generation on behalf of the next. And what's remarkable, what should make any honest observer stop and reckon with, is that it's working, imperfectly, with genuine failures woven into real progress. But the arc is bending. Forest cover tripled, dust storms down 81%, 25% of Earth's new vegetation, 87 nations sending scientists to learn. The future of this planet's livable surface is, in part, being determined right now by a project that started before most of the people watching this video were born. A project most people in the West have never heard of. A project that, whatever your politics, whatever your view of China, is the largest attempt in human history to repair damage done to the natural world. The desert is still fighting. So are the trees. Who wins that fight will tell us a great deal about what human beings are actually capable of when they decide to act at the scale the problem requires. The question isn't whether China's Great Green Wall will finish on time. The question is, what does it mean that no one else even started? Leave that in the comments. I want to know what you think, and if this is the kind of story you want more of. Real scale, real stakes, real consequences. Subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.